The palace rises from the Florida shoreline like a fever dream made solid. 128 rooms sprawling across 17 acres of Barrier Island, caught between ocean and inland waterway, in a geographic arrangement so improbable it seems designed by someone who believed wealth could override physics itself. This is Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake, and its story is the story of American power in all its contradictory glory. A century-long meditation on who builds, who owns, who serves, and who ultimately pays for the monuments we erect to prove our importance to a world that may not be watching as closely as we imagine. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The building's existence begins with a wound, which is perhaps appropriate for something that would eventually become a national scar. Marjorie Merriweather Post inherited a cereal empire in 1914 when her father died and she was 27 years old, suddenly commanding a fortune that would translate to billions in contemporary currency. Money arrived in her life like a flood, drowning her in possibilities while simultaneously exposing the one thing it could not purchase. The old families of American aristocracy, the Astors and Vanderbilts whose fortunes stretched back through railroad monopolies and banking dynasties, looked at her cereal money with barely concealed contempt. Breakfast food sold in boxes to ordinary Americans was not serious wealth in their estimation. It lacked pedigree, lacked the weight of generations, lacked the particular kind of historical gravity that separated those who truly belonged from those who merely had resources. Marjorie felt this rejection in every polite but distant interaction, every invitation that arrived but never quite opened the innermost circles, every conversation that suggested she was tolerated rather than embraced. She collected Russian imperial treasures and French furniture and Renaissance paintings, cultivated impeccable taste, entertained lavishly, married 4 times seeking connection and validation, and still the invisible wall remained. The pain of this exclusion drove her to a decision that would echo across a century. She would build something so spectacular, so undeniably magnificent, that ignoring her would become impossible. If acceptance would not come through invitation, it would come through sheer, overwhelming presence. The choice of location was strategic. Palm Beach in the 1920s was becoming the winter refuge of exactly the people who made Marjorie feel like an outsider, their grand houses lining the island in architectural displays of inherited privilege. She purchased a narrow strip of land for approximately $1.5 million, a staggering sum for the era, choosing property that stretched from Atlantic to inland waterway in a geographic assertion of dominance. The land itself made a statement before a single stone was laid. She hired architects Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban and gave them instructions that were simultaneously precise and impossible. She wanted Spanish Moorish grandeur, European sophistication, and distinctly American confidence in scale. She wanted imported tiles from dissolved Spanish estates, gold leaf ceilings, a tower visible for miles. She wanted something that no one could dismiss as merely adequate. Construction began in 1925 and immediately revealed the machinery beneath all great American fortunes. The project required 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, stone from Mediterranean quarries, carved wooden ceilings commissioned from Italian craftsmen, materials shipped across oceans at extraordinary expense. The workforce peaked at more than 200 people during the most intense phases, local laborers doing the heaviest work in punishing Florida heat and humidity for wages that barely covered survival. Many of these workers were Black and Hispanic men whose names vanished from the historical record even as their hands set every tile and carved every detail that would eventually define the mansion's beauty. They worked under conditions that generated routine injuries, falls from scaffolding, cuts from stone and glass, cases of heat exhaustion that were noted, if at all, only as obstacles to maintaining the construction schedule that Marjorie's managers demanded. The mansion rose slowly, room by room, a fantasy constructed through very material suffering. The main house covered 62,500 square feet when completed. 75 rooms in the original design, a number that would grow. Hand-painted tiles in bathrooms, silk wall coverings in bedrooms, a golden ballroom large enough to hold hundreds. But to understand the true scale, you had to see what lay beneath and behind, the invisible city built to sustain the illusion. Sprawling kitchens connected to the main house through service corridors designed to keep workers out of sight. Industrial-scale refrigeration, massive laundries, mechanical rooms housing boilers and pumps, and early air conditioning systems, a luxury almost unheard of in 1920s Florida. The staff quarters formed a separate closed world, accommodating 50 to 60 people during the season, all necessary to maintain the appearance of effortless elegance. Service staircases allowed workers to move through the house without crossing paths with guests. Kitchen entrances faced away from formal gardens. Marjorie wanted perfection, but she wanted it to appear weightless, magical, never the obvious product of hard, visible labor performed by people whose existence she preferred not to acknowledge. The cost was staggering even by Gilded Age standards. Estimates placed the construction bill between $7 and $10 million, well over $150 million in contemporary currency, covering only the building itself before furnishings or art, or the endless maintenance that would consume additional millions across subsequent decades. The timing made everything more striking. Mar-a-Lago was completed in 1929, the same year the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began its devastation of ordinary American lives. While Marjorie entertained in her ballroom, bread lines formed in cities across the country. While her staff served elaborate dinners on gold-trimmed china, families elsewhere struggled to afford basic meals. The contrast was brutal and impossible to ignore, though many in Palm Beach society tried their best. Marjorie herself apparently never saw this contradiction as a moral problem, believing sincerely that her fortune created jobs, that her spending kept money moving through the economy, that her patronage of artists and craftsmen served some wider good. Whether the men cutting stone in the Florida sun agreed with this assessment is something history does not record because no one thought to ask them. The mansion opened for its first full season in early 1930 and quickly became legendary for parties that mixed Hollywood names with Washington power and Wall Street money. Orchestras played in the ballroom, champagne flowed despite prohibition. Guest lists were crafted with meticulous care, diplomats and business titans and minor European nobility, whose presence Marjorie valued above almost anything else because their titles were real, their family trees stretched back centuries, and their attendance suggested she had finally broken through the invisible barrier that had tormented her for so long. But the question remained unanswered. The parties proved she had resources and taste, but they did not erase the fundamental problem. Old society had its rules, and breakfast cereal money still was not serious money in the estimation of the families who controlled those rules. The winter seasons followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. Every November, Marjorie arrived, and for weeks beforehand the staff prepared, polishing every surface, airing every room, stocking kitchens for months of entertaining. The dinners were productions requiring military precision in kitchens below where the heat was relentless and mistakes were unforgivable. Head chefs commanded teams working 12-hour shifts during major events, sometimes longer, managing tightly timed sequences that moved dishes from prep tables to stoves to serving trays while gas ranges blazed and steam rose and burns from hot pans and scalding water became routine occupational hazards. Beyond the kitchens, laundry rooms tackled mountains of linens that had to be washed and pressed without a wrinkle. Outside, groundskeepers maintained 17 acres in immaculate condition, trimming grass to exact heights, shaping hedges with geometric precision, fighting the constant threat of salt air eating at metal and stone. Mechanical systems demanded monitoring to ensure lights never failed during crucial moments. Men worked in windowless rooms filled with machinery roar, watching gauges and adjusting valves to keep the illusion intact. The staff lived in a separate world, physically close but socially distant. Their quarters were comfortable by the standards of the time, better than many service jobs offered. But the boundary was firm. They entered the main house only through designated doors, used specific staircases, learned to move through rooms as if invisible, always present but rarely acknowledged. Marjorie apparently treated her staff with what she believed was kindness, remembering names and asking about families and giving Christmas bonuses. By the standards of wealthy employers in the 1930s, she was considered fair, even generous. But fair and generous still meant a rigid hierarchy, still meant workers who could not dream of sending their children to the schools where Marjorie's grandchildren studied, still meant a ballroom where staff could arrange flowers and polish floors, but never dance. The contrast was always there, even if few named it aloud. Upstairs, guests in evening gowns sipped champagne and compared European travels. Downstairs, workers in sweat-stained uniforms hauled wine cases and scrubbed cooking grease from industrial ranges. The fantasy depended entirely on this division. The world beyond Palm Beach was changing through the late 1930s as Europe moved inexorably toward war. At Mar-a-Lago, the parties continued with almost stubborn consistency. The guest list shifted slightly toward more American industrialists and military officers, but the ritual stayed the same, the quiet assumption that this particular arrangement of wealth and privilege would last forever. Marjorie had built something she thought was permanent: craftsmanship and art and stone and marble, the things that endured. But permanence proved more complicated than architecture. When America entered World War II in December 1941, everything shifted. Young men from staff families enlisted or were drafted. Rationing reached even the grandest houses. The Coast Guard established patrols along Florida beaches, watching for German submarines reportedly operating uncomfortably close to shore. Mar-a-Lago was offered to the government as a possible military site, but declined as too conspicuous and impractical. The war years exposed the mansion's vulnerability. The stone walls and gold ceilings that seemed so solid were actually fragile, dependent on constant maintenance that wartime conditions made difficult. Staff shortages meant some rooms went uncleaned. Salt air began eating away at surfaces no longer fought back with the same intensity. For the first time since completion, Mar-a-Lago began showing its age. Marjorie was aging too, 58 by 1945, her third marriage strained, her children absorbed in their own lives and showing little interest in the social universe she had struggled so hard to enter. The question that had haunted her for decades began changing shape. No longer would they accept me, but instead, who will want this when I am gone? The answer was not obvious. The mansion was magnificent, but magnificence came with crushing costs. Yearly maintenance ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property taxes were substantial. Staff payrolls were heavy. The building consumed money at a rate that strained even Marjorie's fortune. More troubling still, her children did not want it. The mansion embodied Marjorie's dream, Marjorie's answer to Marjorie's particular wound. Her children had their own dreams and their own wounds, and none of them wanted to inherit the burden of a palace that demanded constant attention and expense and emotional effort. Marjorie made her decision in 1973 at 86 years old, with declining health and a fortune drained by decades of maintaining multiple estates. She would give Mar-a-Lago to the United States government to become a winter White House, where American leaders could host foreign dignitaries in surroundings displaying the country's wealth and cultural sophistication. The idea seemed both logical and generous. She drew up the will with clear terms. Upon her death, the property would pass to the federal government with all furnishings and art intact, a complete world fully staged and ready for use. She died on September 12, 1973, and the government review that followed was thorough and brutal. The National Park Service sent representatives whose report acknowledged the mansion's beauty and historical importance, but concluded it was spectacularly impractical as a government facility. Maintenance costs would exceed $1 to $2 million annually just for basic operation. Security was a nightmare. The property sat on a narrow strip with ocean on one side and lake on the other, multiple access points, a long perimeter hard to control. Making it secure enough for presidential use would require heavy modifications that would cost additional millions and fundamentally change the estate's character. Palm Beach residents made clear that a permanent federal presence with checkpoints and security cordons would not be welcome. The Park Service recommended declining the gift. In 1981, after years of legal maneuvering, the government formally returned Mar-a-Lago to Marjorie's estate. The dream of a winter White House ended before it truly began. The rejection exposed the same problem that had shadowed Marjorie herself throughout her life: excess. The house was simply too much, too large, too costly, too demanding, too tied to one woman's very specific idea of grandeur. What worked as a personal statement of wealth became a burden the moment someone else was asked to take responsibility. Through much of the early 1980s, the mansion sat mostly empty. A skeleton staff kept basic systems running. Wings were closed off. Dust gathered on surfaces that once gleamed under candlelight. Gardens slipped toward wildness. Salt water continued its slow, patient work of corrosion. Mar-a-Lago was beautiful and vacant, and increasingly desperate for someone willing to shoulder its extreme costs and complexity. Donald Trump first saw the property in 1985 at 39 years old, riding high on New York real estate deals and hungry for something that would prove he was not just rich, but important. Trump Tower had opened 3 years earlier. The Trump name glowed on Manhattan buildings. But New York was crowded with other developers and other claims to greatness. Florida seemed different, offering the chance to acquire something with history and prestige already built in. Trump's first move was characteristically aggressive, offering $5 million, a fraction of construction costs, and a number reflecting the property's core problem. As a practical investment, it was almost worthless. Estate executives, reportedly offended, turned him down. Trump answered by buying the beach parcel directly in front of Mar-a-Lago for $2 million, declaring plans to put high-rise condominiums on that strip and block the mansion's ocean view. Whether he truly meant to follow through or mainly wanted leverage remains unclear, but the leverage worked. Faced with their oceanfront masterpiece becoming a landlocked relic behind concrete towers, executives came back to the table. In 1985, Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago and its furnishings for roughly $8 million total, still a steep discount, but apparently the best realistic offer. Trump's immediate problem was identical to what had defeated the federal government. The property burned through money at an incredible rate. His answer fit his particular talent for turning status into cash. He would convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club. The transformation began in 1995 with roughly $3 million in renovations, upgrading electrical systems, modernizing kitchens, refurbishing decayed rooms, but keeping the core intact. Trump understood that what he was selling was not comfort or convenience, but access to a very specific fantasy. The club model was simple. Members paid an initiation fee, initially $100,000, later raised to $200,000, plus annual dues around $14,000. In return, they received access to the property and, most importantly, the social capital of being able to say they belonged to Mar-a-Lago. Trump marketed relentlessly through interviews with architecture magazines and tours for society writers and carefully staged photo spreads. The message was sharp and consistent. Mar-a-Lago was not just a club but an inner circle, and membership meant you had arrived. Palm Beach society was not universally charmed. The town already had its pillars: the Bath and Tennis Club and the Everglades Club, with history stretching back decades and membership lists guarded like state secrets. Those clubs had rejected Trump's own applications, reportedly because of his flashy persona and casino gambling ties. Trump's counter-move was to brand Mar-a-Lago as deliberately different. While established clubs maintained policies excluding Jews and African Americans, practices increasingly controversial but still present, Trump made Mar-a-Lago explicitly open regardless of religion or race. Whether this sprang from principle or strategy or some mix remains debated. Whatever the motive, the strategy worked. Within a few years, Mar-a-Lago had several hundred members. Initiation fees alone brought in tens of millions. Annual dues created predictable revenue. Trump had solved the mansion's fundamental problem by finding a way to make other people pay to maintain Marjorie's dream. The club was never just a business. From the start, Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a stage for his own ambitions, hosting lavish parties engineered to generate headlines, inviting politicians and athletes and entertainers whose presence signaled power or fame, giving interviews framed by opulent backgrounds that reinforced the image he wanted to project. Mar-a-Lago was becoming what Marjorie had perhaps always imagined: a place where important things happened, where important people gathered, where decisions that mattered were made. The open question was whether those events would ultimately honor the mansion or twist it into something darker than Marjorie could have pictured. The election of 2016 changed everything. When Donald Trump won the presidency in November, defeating Hillary Clinton, in a result that stunned pollsters and pundits, Mar-a-Lago's status shifted overnight. The property the federal government had once rejected as too impractical for presidential use was about to become exactly that, not officially, but in practice. Trump made his intentions clear immediately. He would spend significant time at Mar-a-Lago during his presidency, host foreign leaders there, conduct government business from the property. The winter White House Marjorie had imagined in her will was finally being realized, though in a way she never could have pictured. Security demands exploded. The Secret Service descended on Palm Beach, turning what had been a luxurious resort into something closer to a fortified compound. Checkpoints appeared on surrounding streets. Coast Guard boats patrolled offshore waters. Airspace above the property became restricted. Agents screened everyone entering, including club members who had paid hundreds of thousands for the illusion of effortless privileged access. The costs were staggering, but unlike with Marjorie's original offer, these costs were not Trump's problem. Federal taxpayers paid for securing the property, protecting the president, managing the logistics of running parts of the government out of a private club. Estimates suggested each presidential visit cost several $1,000,000 in security and operational expenses. Palm Beach residents who had tolerated the club with mixed feelings now faced reality far more disruptive than anything they had imagined. Roads closed whenever the president was in residence. Traffic snarled around security checkpoints. The quiet, carefully curated exclusivity of the town was repeatedly shattered by motorcades and helicopters and the constant noise of presidential machinery. Lawsuits followed over noise and traffic and what neighbors said were falling property values. The town council held contentious meetings about Trump's legal residency. Mar-a-Lago's deed reportedly included a clause limiting it to club use rather than permanent residence, a restriction Trump was now clearly challenging. These fights played out in local hearings and national headlines, turning the property from a glamorous backdrop into an ongoing legal and political battlefield. The most important change was not logistical, but symbolic. Mar-a-Lago became shorthand for everything dividing America in the Trump era. For supporters, the mansion embodied success and achievement. Trump had taken a property no one wanted and made it profitable, became president while still owning a business empire. The gold leaf ceilings and marble floors read as proof of American prosperity and confidence. Hosting foreign leaders at Mar-a-Lago seemed like a demonstration that private enterprise could match or surpass the formal White House in style and comfort. For critics, Mar-a-Lago represented the worst possible merging of public office and private profit. Trump owned the club, made money from memberships and events. Foreign governments and corporate interests looking for favor could buy access simply by joining or hosting functions there. The membership fee doubled to $200,000 after the election, a price that now bought not just social prestige but potential proximity to the President of the United States. The ethical concerns were serious and largely unprecedented. Club members could overhear sensitive conversations. Foreign leaders stayed in rooms belonging to Trump's business. Government matters were discussed at dinner tables surrounded by paying customers. The line between official duty and private business blurred, then largely disappeared. In February 2017, Trump hosted Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Mar-a-Lago. During dinner on the outdoor terrace surrounded by club members, word arrived that North Korea had launched a ballistic missile. Trump and Abe discussed the situation at the table while members watched and took photos on their phones. Documents were reportedly visible. Security protocols mandatory inside the White House seemed absent or loosely enforced. The episode triggered outrage. Congressional Democrats demanded investigations. Ethics experts called it a shocking breach. Even some Republicans expressed unease, though most stayed publicly supportive. Trump brushed off the criticism as partisan attack, insisting Mar-a-Lago was secure and nothing improper had taken place. The incident revealed something deeper. Mar-a-Lago's identity had shifted yet again. It was no longer just a mansion or even just a club. It had become a stage where presidential power and private money and political symbolism and genuine national security risks collided in ways no other building in American history had experienced. The estate Marjorie had built to prove her importance had finally become important on a scale she never imagined. But that importance carried a darkness she never would have chosen, a darkness that was about to deepen when boxes arrived in January 2021. When Donald Trump left the White House after losing the 2020 election to Joe Biden, he took with him something no former president had ever taken on that scale: thousands of pages of government documents. Some were routine correspondence. Some were administrative records, and some, according to later federal investigations, were classified materials ranging from confidential to top secret, documents touching on nuclear capabilities, defense plans, intelligence sources, and sensitive diplomatic communications. These papers traveled from Washington to Mar-a-Lago in ordinary cardboard boxes, reportedly about 15 initially, though the exact number would be disputed. They were stored in a basement storage room, then moved to other spots on the property, including, according to federal prosecutors, the ballroom where Marjorie's guests had once danced beneath gold leaf ceilings. By early 2022, the National Archives, the federal agency responsible for preserving presidential records, realized significant material was missing. Officials requested its return. Trump's representatives negotiated. Some documents were sent back in January 2022, but archive staff immediately noticed classified markings on materials that should never have left secure government facilities. The Justice Department opened a criminal investigation. Subpoenas followed. Trump's attorneys searched Mar-a-Lago and told the government all classified materials had now been returned, providing a sworn certification in June 2022. The certification was false. Federal investigators had evidence that classified documents were still at Mar-a-Lago. On August 8, 2022, FBI agents executed a search warrant at the property. The search itself was historic. No former president had ever faced such action. Agents spent hours moving from room to room, photographing spaces, seizing materials. When done, they had recovered more than 100 additional classified documents, some marked at the highest levels of secrecy. Photographs later released in court filings showed files spread across what appeared to be a storage area floor, classification stamps clearly visible, top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information, documents that, if exposed to foreign intelligence services, could allegedly compromise American operations and put lives at risk. All of this had been stored inside a building that hosted hundreds of club members, event staff, maintenance workers, and guests. A building used for weddings and corporate parties. A building on an easily accessible barrier island connected to the mainland by public roads and a bridge. Trump's reaction was immediate and furious, calling the search a raid, an assault, an abuse of power, claiming the FBI planted evidence, insisting documents were declassified though no formal proof emerged, arguing that as president, he had absolute authority to take whatever he wanted. His supporters closed ranks. To them, the search became proof of deep state conspiracy. Protesters gathered outside gates. Conservative media attacked FBI motives. Republican politicians denounced the Justice Department and framed the investigation as purely political. Critics saw something very different: a former president who removed classified materials, resisted returning them, allowed his lawyers to make false statements, and stored sensitive intelligence in a social club where security was handled by private employees trained in hospitality, not counterintelligence. Federal prosecutors convened a grand jury. In June 2023, Trump was indicted on 37 counts related to mishandling classified documents and obstructing justice, with more charges added later. The case was assigned to Judge Aileen Cannon in the Southern District of Florida. The trial was set, then pushed back as legal motions piled up, attacking the search warrant, the charges, the special counsel's authority, almost every structural piece of the prosecution. The case became one more battlefield in the larger political war around Trump, with each side completely convinced of its own righteousness and the other's corruption. Yet beneath the politics and spin, one simple physical fact remained. Classified documents had been stored in a mansion built for parties. The ballroom at the controversy center had witnessed nearly a century of Mar-a-Lago's transformations, hosting Marjorie's carefully staged dinners, Trump's club galas, Diplomats during the presidency. Now, in legal filings and news reports, it was described as either a crime scene or the focus of a witch hunt, depending entirely on who was talking. The estate that had always been about appearances, about projecting power and importance, now sat at the heart of questions about whether that power had been abused and whether those appearances had hidden something genuinely dangerous. The legal proceedings continued, but life at Mar-a-Lago went on. Weddings were still booked in the ballroom. Club members still dined on the terrace overlooking the ocean. Event staff still arranged flowers and polished silverware. The machinery that had kept the mansion running since Marjorie's time, the invisible work, the careful maintenance, the constant attention to detail, continued regardless of headlines or investigations. This persistence raised a harder question. What happens to a place when its symbolism overwhelms its reality? When the stories told about it, competing and contradictory and politically charged, start to matter more than the physical space itself. Mar-a-Lago had become all of these things at once: a working social club, a former president's residence, a site of federal investigation, a symbol brandished by both political tribes to prove opposite arguments. And yet, it was also still a building that needed daily care, from people whose names almost never appeared in any of those stories. The staff who maintained Mar-a-Lago in 2023 stood in a line stretching back to the 1920s. Housekeepers cleaned the same rooms their predecessors had cleaned. Groundskeepers tended descendants of the same palm trees. Kitchen crews prepared meals in spaces modernized over decades, but keeping the same basic purpose: feeding wealthy people who came to be seen in a place they believed mattered. Those workers experienced Mar-a-Lago's controversies very differently from club members or television commentators. For them, the mansion was not first a symbol, but an employer. Legal trouble meant risk of cutbacks. Protests and counter-protests meant navigating crowds and checkpoints just to get to a shift. Media attention meant reporters occasionally approaching them for comments they were contractually forbidden to give. Their relationship to the property was fundamentally different from everyone else's. Club members paid for proximity to prestige. Politicians used the location to signal alliances. Trump owned it as both home and asset. The workers needed it to keep operating so they could earn wages that, while reportedly better than many service jobs in Palm Beach, still looked small compared to the fortunes on display around them. This economic truth had been there since Marjorie's era, but became more visible and more uncomfortable as Mar-a-Lago's political meaning grew. The same building that symbolized American success to some and American corruption to others was for its workers simply a site of labor. Hard, often unseen work that made every party, every summit, every photo opportunity possible. The historical echo was hard to miss. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago with help from craftsmen whose names vanished from the record. Trump kept it running with employees whose identities stayed just as anonymous unless something went wrong. The mansion consumed their time and effort while directing attention upward toward owners and guests and the dramas playing out in decorated rooms. Beyond the immediate staff, the mansion's impact rippled outward in ways difficult to measure. Palm Beach residents dealt with traffic closures and security delays. Local businesses sometimes gained from visitor influx and sometimes lost customers who wanted to avoid chaos. Property values near the estate shifted based on whether being close to presidential activity was seen as perk or headache. There were environmental costs too, rarely mentioned in political arguments but impossible to ignore. Keeping 17 acres of perfectly manicured grounds alive in Florida demanded huge amounts of water. Climate control for a structure that size required constant energy. The estate sat on a barrier island increasingly vulnerable to rising sea levels and stronger hurricanes. Climate forces that would sooner or later force choices about whether and how to defend a house built almost at the water's edge. All of these concrete realities existed beneath and alongside the symbolism. Mar-a-Lago was at once a monument to excess and a workplace, a political weapon and a fragile building on eroding land, a lightning rod for national arguments, and a place where people simply tried to finish their shifts and get home. To understand the mansion's full story, you had to hold all perspectives together, not picking one true narrative, but accepting that Mar-a-Lago contained many, that its meaning was fractured, that different people lived inside that meaning in radically different ways. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago to answer a personal question about belonging and significance. The building had achieved a level of significance far beyond anything she imagined. But the question of belonging, who belonged there, who was kept out, who gained and who quietly paid, remained as tangled and unresolved as ever. The mansion stood on its narrow strip of land, still beautiful despite scandal, still expensive, still argued over, still demanding constant labor from people who would never own it, and constant commentary from people who would never set foot inside. The ocean continued its patient assault on the seawall. Tourists kept snapping photos from public beaches. Protesters and supporters repeated their rituals outside gates. And inside the daily work continued. Floors mopped, meals prepared, light fixtures dusted, gardens trimmed. The dream Marjorie built had survived, but survival was not the same thing as victory. The lessons were there, whether anyone chose to see them. Mar-a-Lago's nearly century-long story reflected America's contradictions with uncomfortable clarity. The mansion was a mirror, and what it showed depended entirely on who was looking and what they were willing to admit. For some, Mar-a-Lago illustrated American exceptionalism at its most dazzling. A determined woman with money and ambition building something extraordinary. An entrepreneur rescuing it from decay and turning it into profitable venture. A president using it as backdrop to project American power to visiting leaders. In that version, the narrative was about private enterprise succeeding where government failed, about individuals creating value and beauty through vision and willpower. For others, the very same sequence told a much darker tale, a wealthy heiress building a monument to herself while the country struggled through depression and inequality, a businessman monetizing access to power in ways that blurred every ethical line, a president merging personal profit and public duty so completely that distinguishing between them became almost impossible. In that telling the story was about unchecked wealth, corroded institutions, and elites playing by rules no one else could access. Both narratives contained truth, and both left out crucial pieces. The real story of Mar-a-Lago was messier and more layered than either political camp wanted to acknowledge. It was a story about labor, generations of workers whose skill and effort built and preserved a place they could not afford to inhabit as guests. It was a story about ambition, Marjorie's desperate attempt to purchase acceptance, Trump's relentless hunger for attention, the way buildings become vessels for human needs that no amount of architecture can fully satisfy. It was also a story about class in America, about the distance between those who serve and those who are served, a distance that barely shifted no matter which wealthy name appeared on the deed or which party held the White House. The workers who carved stone and set tile in the late 1920s and the staff who changed linens and carried trays in the early 2020s occupied strikingly similar rungs on the social ladder, separated by a century, but joined by the same dynamic, their labor underpinning someone else's luxury. It was a story about how Americans mythologize wealth. Marjorie believed overwhelming display would force respect. Trump believed surrounding himself with opulence would prove his importance. Both were partly right and partly wrong. The mansion did command attention, did signal power, did generate a certain kind of significance, but it also exposed the hollowness at the center of power that exists mostly for show, the way gold-leaf ceilings and imported marble can feel impressive and empty at the same time, beautiful and strangely meaningless. The mansion revealed, too, how easily public and private interests fuse together once wealth reaches a certain level. Marjorie's attempt to give Mar-a-Lago to the government failed, but Trump's use of it as presidential stage succeeded, creating exactly the kind of conflicts her rejected gift had been meant to avoid. The building exposed gaps in ethics rules, in security assumptions, in the unwritten norms about how presidents should behave and where the boundaries of acceptable conduct really lie. Most of all, Mar-a-Lago's story highlighted what Americans chose to notice and what they quietly ignored. The classified documents saga triggered intense political warfare, but the decades of invisible labor that kept the mansion running barely registered in public debate. Legal fights over Trump's residency generated headlines, but the environmental fragility of lavish estates on barrier islands received little sustained attention. Commentators dissected the price of club memberships in detail, while the pay and conditions of workers who made the club possible were rarely examined with the same intensity. Those patterns of attention echoed broader national habits. Drama traveled fast. Spectacle drew cameras. Clashes between powerful figures felt urgent because power always did. The slow structural questions, who did which work for how much, who carried which risks so others could enjoy which comforts, were quieter, harder to turn into outrage, easier to leave in the background. Mar-a-Lago had become a symbol, but symbols flatten and distort by design. The mansion was not simply good or evil, not only a monument to success or just a temple of corruption. It was both and neither, a complicated place with a complicated past refusing to shrink down to a single clean meaning. The house had outlived its creator and would almost certainly outlive its current owner. The unresolved question was what it would become next, and whether that next chapter would be shaped deliberately or simply happen by inertia, determined by whoever had enough money and ego to claim it. Buildings do not choose their owners or their roles. People do. The decisions made about Mar-a-Lago, whether to preserve it, repurpose it, regulate it, condemn it, or simply let it continue its strange hybrid existence, would say a great deal about American values and priorities. Looking honestly at the reflection was only the first step. The harder question was what to do with what you saw. Mar-a-Lago existed inside a legal and ethical framework never designed for a place like this. A former president owning commercial property while potentially running for office again created conflicts that existing rules could barely describe, let alone regulate. A private social club that had served as presidential venue sat in a gray zone between business and state, between leisure and official function that no current regulation really covered. Yet, the problems Mar-a-Lago exposed were not at their core about one house or one man. They were structural, baked into systems that treated extraordinary wealth as automatically legitimate and assumed that financial success signaled virtue, competence, or destiny. The mansion's history pointed to several areas where American society might need to rethink assumptions. First, the relationship between wealth and political power demanded a clearer, more honest look. The fact that membership at Mar-a-Lago reportedly provided proximity to a sitting president was not a glitch in the system, but an extreme example of how money routinely buys access through campaign donations, lobbying budgets, think tank funding, revolving doors between regulators and industries they oversee. Mar-a-Lago simply made the process more literal and easier to see. Fixing this would require structural changes, not just outrage, stricter ethics rules with real teeth, enforcement mechanisms that actually carried consequences, transparency requirements exposing who met with whom, where, and for what purpose. It would mean acknowledging that proximity to power is itself a valuable asset, that access is a kind of currency, and that allowing it to be openly bought creates a system in which government inevitably leans toward those who can pay the price of entry. Second, the treatment of labor needed more honest reckoning. Every mansion, every luxury resort, every carefully curated display of wealth rested on work of people whose contributions were routinely undervalued and invisible. The public fights over Mar-a-Lago were staged around ownership and law and symbolism, while the workers who kept the building functioning barely appeared in the story at all. That invisibility was part of the design, supporting the comforting fantasy that wealth creates itself, that luxury springs naturally from talent and effort rather than from organized extraction of value from other people's time and bodies. Bringing workers into the frame, knowing their names, understanding their schedules and protections, ensuring they received fair pay and basic dignity would require admitting uncomfortable truths about how American comfort is actually produced and who is carrying the weight. Third, preservation and purpose of historic properties needed rethinking. Mar-a-Lago was architecturally significant regardless of political baggage. Marjorie's Spanish tiles, carved ceilings, eccentric but meticulous design choices all had genuine cultural and historical value. But that value was locked behind membership fees and security gates, accessible mostly to those who could write very large checks. There were other paths. Historic homes across the country had been turned into museums, educational sites, archives, public spaces. Those conversions recognized that some buildings matter beyond their role as private assets, that their stories belong to more people than just whoever holds the deed at a given moment. Mar-a-Lago could, in theory, tell stories about the Gilded Age, about architecture as self-mythology, about labor and class, about the collision of wealth and democracy. Making that happen would take political will that does not yet exist, but Mar-a-Lago will not stay exactly as it is forever. Through sale or inheritance or legal judgment, or even storms and rising seas, its status will eventually change. Planning for that change, thinking beyond simply handing it to the next billionaire, could open doors to uses serving more than a few hundred club members. Fourth, and maybe most fundamentally, Americans needed more nuanced ways of thinking about wealth itself. The habit of treating large fortunes as straightforward proof of merit, as evidence of intelligence or discipline or moral worth, obscured messy reality. Wealth almost always came from a mix of inheritance, timing, existing connections, labor of others, government infrastructure, legal protections, and yes, sometimes genuine skill and hard work, but never those alone. Marjorie inherited a cereal empire. Trump inherited millions and a real estate network from his father. Neither started from nothing, though both leaned into versions of that myth. Those myths mattered because they turned inequality into a morality play, making it seem earned, natural, almost inevitable, instead of the product of policy choices, historical advantages, and compounding privilege. More honest stories about wealth, stories that include inheritances and tax codes and land use laws and race and gender and immigration status and simple luck, would not erase inequality, but might open space to ask whether the current distribution of resources actually serves the country well, or whether different arrangements could work better for more people. None of these conversations are easy. They challenge deeply rooted American stories about individualism and meritocracy and the moral beauty of accumulation. They ask people who benefit from the current system to admit that the game has never been purely fair, that personal success sits on top of structures many others never had chance to use. Mar-a-Lago cannot force anyone to have these conversations, but its history offers concrete entry points, specific undeniable examples that make abstract issues visible. Who gets access and why? Who does the work and for how much? How public power and private wealth intertwine inside a single set of walls. The open question is whether Americans will use those entry points or keep fighting over symbols while leaving the underlying structures, the ones Mar-a-Lago has exposed so clearly, exactly as they are. The structures would outlast the arguments, just as the mansion had outlasted its builders. Dawn reached Mar-a-Lago the same way it had for nearly a century, light spreading over the Atlantic, touching waves first, then sand, then the seawall separating ocean from property. The same wall workers had poured and stacked in the 1920s, repaired after storms, patched and reinforced again and again, but never changed in its basic purpose, holding back water that would otherwise reclaim the land. The ocean was patient. It could wait. Inside the mansion, daily routine started up once more. Security guards changed shifts, kitchen staff came in to prepare breakfast, maintenance workers checked systems that always needed watching. The building demanded care as it always had, as it always would. That continuity was perhaps the clearest truth about Mar-a-Lago. Beneath the controversies and symbolism, beneath the political fights and legal filings, it remained a physical structure that survived only through physical labor. Headlines shifted. Owners would sooner or later change. The meaning attached to the place rose and fell with cultural storms. But the work of keeping it standing went on, done by people whose names would never appear in history books, whose perspectives would not shape the narratives, whose daily effort made every other story possible. Those workers understood something observers often missed. Buildings are not really about the names on deeds or even the architects on plans. Buildings are about the ongoing negotiation between human effort and physical reality. Stone crumbles, paint peels, wiring fails. Gardens choke with weeds if no one tends them. The mansion's survival depended not on grand visions or dramatic moments, but on quiet, repetitive tasks, noticing what was starting to break and fixing it day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The ocean kept pushing at the seawall. Climate change was speeding erosion along Florida coasts. Sea levels were rising in measurable documented inches. Storms were growing stronger. Within decades, possibly within years, Mar-a-Lago could face a real existential threat, not from politics or court cases, but from physics. Water creeping higher, land sinking lower. The basic instability of building elaborate structures on narrow barrier islands in an unstable climate. That threat was democratic in a way human conflicts were not. The ocean did not care about property values or political slogans or historical significance. It would come for Mar-a-Lago the same way it came for modest cottages and public beaches, testing every foundation, finding every weakness, claiming whatever could not be defended. At some point, the seawall would fail. Maybe it could be rebuilt, raised, armored with new engineering. Maybe technology would delay the outcome. Or maybe not. Maybe future generations would look at photographs of Mar-a-Lago the way people now look at images of vanished coastal towns, beautiful once, gone now, taken back by forces larger than any individual's wealth or will. If that loss comes, it will teach lessons the political scandals never could, showing that grandeur is temporary, that power has limits, that nature operates on scales making human drama look small. The same ocean that made Mar-a-Lago's views priceless would prove stronger than the walls built to frame them. But that is the future. The present offered quieter lessons available to anyone willing to really look. The lesson of continuity, that work goes on regardless of headlines, that ordinary effort sustains extraordinary places, that maintenance, not spectacle, is what keeps the world from falling apart. The lesson of complexity, that places hold multiple truths at once, that a single building can be both beautiful and compromised, admirable and troubling, and that history is never simple enough to fit cleanly into one side story. The lesson of consequence, that private choices have public effects, that personal ambition shapes collective reality, that the past is not safely sealed away behind us, but woven into the present, guiding what feels possible and what feels inevitable. None of these lessons require expertise to understand. They require only attention, the willingness to see Mar-a-Lago not just as a symbol to win an argument with, but as a real location with a real past, constructed by real people, maintained by real labor, sitting in a real environment that will ultimately decide how long it can remain. Attention was a choice, and choices about what to remember shaped what the future would inherit. Mar-a-Lago's story would be told and retold, but which version would last? Would it be the tale of Marjorie's social ambition, a woman building a palace to prove her worth? Would it be Trump's transformation of the estate into a political stage, the winter White House that finally came into being but generated more controversy than prestige? Would it be the classified documents saga, boxes in a ballroom, the moment when a mansion became evidence in a federal prosecution? Or would it be something else, a version that included all of these threads but refused to crown any single one as the whole truth? The danger with symbolic places was that they became containers for whatever meanings people needed them to hold. Mar-a-Lago could stand for American excess or American achievement, corruption or entrepreneurship, class division or opportunity. Each reading could be defended with carefully chosen facts. Each served particular political or ideological goals, and each in its own way hid as much as it revealed. Honest memory meant resisting this flattening, insisting that places carried multiple truths even when those truths clashed or made simple judgments impossible. Mar-a-Lago was at once a remarkable work of architecture and a monument to inequality, both a property rescued from decay and a vehicle for blending public duty with private profit, both a workplace for hundreds of employees and a symbol wielded in national political fights. All of these things were true at the same time. Accepting that required learning to hold contradictions without rushing to resolve them, to live with complexity without forcing it into a neat moral lesson. The historical record would preserve certain hard facts, dates of construction, chains of ownership, design details, court cases, but facts on their own were not understanding. Understanding needed context, interpretation, a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about whose stories were recorded and whose were missing, whose voices were amplified and whose were muted. The workers who built and maintained Mar-a-Lago deserved to be part of that story, not as scenery but as central figures whose labor was as essential as any architect's sketch or owner's dream. Their names, when they could be recovered, should be written down. Their working conditions should be described. Their perspectives, when they could be safely shared, should sit alongside those of presidents and heiresses and developers. The environmental setting deserved equal attention. Mar-a-Lago did not float in a vacuum. It sat on a barrier island, dependent on fragile ecosystems and exposed to rising seas and stronger storms. The decision to erect elaborate permanent structures in such places reflected assumptions about human control over nature that were growing less believable with every hurricane season. Future historians might judge the whole pattern, not just Mar-a-Lago, but the broader culture of coastal luxury building it symbolized, as fundamentally misguided, a refusal to accept physical limits that climate change would eventually enforce. The economic systems that made Mar-a-Lago possible also warranted scrutiny. Marjorie's fortune came from food processing, an industry rooted in agricultural labor and mass consumer markets. Trump's money came from real estate, an industry tightly tied to banking and tax policy and zoning laws and long histories of racial discrimination and segregation. Neither fortune was self-created. Both rested on broader structures, legal frameworks, and other people's work. Honest history named those structures instead of repeating myths of the lone self-made genius. The cultural meanings of the mansion would keep shifting. What seemed crucial in the early 2020s might feel minor or even puzzling to observers in the early 2070s. The political storms that made the property infamous would fade as their main actors left the stage and new controversies took their place. But the building itself, if it survived, would remain, a physical artifact of early 20th century ambition, an early 21st century conflict layered with meanings that each generation would revisit and revise. That constant reinterpretation was inevitable. The real question was whether it would be careful or careless, whether future Americans would do the difficult work of understanding context and complexity, or simply project their own anxieties backward, bending history to fit present needs without regard for past realities. Education offered one of the few defenses against lazy interpretation. If Mar-a-Lago ever became a museum or historic site, possible, though far from guaranteed, it could carry several lessons at once. Architectural tours could sit beside explorations of labor history. Conversations about beauty and craftsmanship could run alongside discussions of class and race and inequality. Admiration for design would not have to erase clear-eyed recognition of who benefited from that design and who paid for it. But education required money and institutions and political support, none of which were automatic. It was entirely plausible that Mar-a-Lago would remain in private hands indefinitely, its story shaped by whoever owned it next, its meanings filtered through marketing needs rather than historical honesty. That outcome would not be uniquely evil, but it would be a missed chance, a decision to leave a powerful teaching tool locked inside a gated club. In the end, the choice belonged to Americans collectively, even if it was expressed through the actions of a few. The choice was not only about Mar-a-Lago's fate, but about what kind of country they wanted to sustain, what they wished to honor, what they were willing to question, what legacy they hoped to leave behind. Buildings reflected those choices back at the people who made them. Mar-a-Lago, whatever else it might be, was a mirror showing Americans things about themselves, some flattering, some disturbing, all revealing. Whether anyone learned from that reflection depended entirely on how honestly they were willing to look. The willingness to really look did not stop at a single property. Mar-a-Lago was not unique. Across the United States, similar stories had played out in different buildings with different owners, but eerily consistent patterns. The Gilded Age left behind dozens of vast estates, Vanderbilt houses, Hearst Castle, DuPont mansions, each a monument to individual wealth, each built by workers whose names rarely survived, each embodying assumptions about class and power that deeply shaped American life. Many of those properties eventually became museums or public parks. The Breakers in Newport, Biltmore in North Carolina, Vizcaya in Miami, all now serving educational roles telling their histories, with varying degrees of honesty about the labor that created them and the inequality they embodied. Mar-a-Lago remained different mostly because it stayed in private hands and became entangled with modern politics, but the deeper questions it raised about concentrated wealth and exploited labor and the tension between private property and public interest were not unique to one mansion. They were built into American capitalism itself. The same dynamics showed up elsewhere. Tech billionaires constructed secluded compounds in Hawaii or Montana, their sprawling estates displacing local communities and consuming land and water while providing little direct public benefit. Financial executives maintained multiple homes, each requiring staff whose wages were tiny fractions of the property values they serviced. The basic relationship between extreme wealth and everyone else had not fundamentally changed since Marjorie's era. It had simply adopted new forms, new landscapes, new justifications. To really understand Mar-a-Lago's story was to see it as part of this larger pattern. The mansion was not a bizarre outlier, but a clear example, a case study in how American society organizes around wealth, who gains from that organization and who absorbs the cost. That recognition has consequences. The next time a controversial property dominates headlines, the questions are already waiting. Who built it? Under what conditions? For what pay? Who keeps it running? What public burdens flow from this private luxury? Where did the owner's fortune come from? Which systems enabled that accumulation? Whose needs does the property ultimately serve? Those questions apply as much to new developments as to old estates, to private residences and commercial projects, to domestic holdings and overseas real estate. The details change, but the underlying logic stays familiar. Wealth concentrated in a few hands using resources that could have served many, producing beautiful or impressive spaces that most people will never enter, depending on labor that is systematically undercompensated and rarely acknowledged. Asking these questions again and again, refusing to be blinded by marble and chandeliers, staying focused on human and environmental costs beneath the spectacle, is a discipline that reaches far beyond Mar-a-Lago. It requires skepticism toward wealth, not automatic condemnation but real curiosity about where money comes from and what it does. It requires attention to power, not only in elections and legislation, but in property ownership and leverage over markets and access to key decision makers. It requires the ability to see beauty and harm together, to admire craftsmanship while also naming exploitation, to recognize that human creations are almost always mixed, never purely noble or purely corrupt. This kind of analysis is hard. It is easier to praise success uncritically or denounce it totally, easier to pick a side and defend it than to sit with ambiguity and contradiction. But easy stories produce shallow understanding, and shallow understanding lets the same patterns repeat in new settings because no one really learned from the last round. Mar-a-Lago offers a chance to learn if people are willing to take it. Its nearly century-long arc contains lessons about ambition and excess, about labor and luxury, about how private property intersects with public interest, about how buildings both reflect and shape the societies that surround them. Those lessons travel well, they can be applied to countless other projects and decisions and debates. But lessons need students. They require willingness to admit that reality is more complicated than partisan talking points, that cherished assumptions might be incomplete or wrong, that systems we benefit from can also be unjust. They call for patience to understand context and for enough resilience to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of pushing them away. Whether Americans collectively have that patience and resilience is still an open question. The shouting matches around Mar-a-Lago suggest otherwise, that partisan loyalty and team identity often drown out nuance, that many people prefer tidy narratives to messy realities. But public conversation is not destiny. Individual choices still matter. Every person who encounters Mar-a-Lago's story through news reports or documentaries or books or a glimpse from a distance in Palm Beach makes decisions about what to notice, what to question, and what to care about. Those small decisions multiplied across thousands or millions of people gradually shape how a society understands itself and what it decides to change or preserve. The mansion cannot force those decisions. It can only sit where it has always sat, its story visible to anyone who cares to trace it. The patterns are there. The lessons are there. The remaining question is what people will choose to do with what they see, what kind of relationship they want to have with wealth and power. Do they want to cheer it on without hesitation, dream of joining it, defend it as proof of what hard work can achieve? Do they want to reject it outright, see only exploitation and excess, flatten everything into villains and victims? Or do they want something harder, to see clearly, to admit both achievement and harm, to hold several truths in their head at once without collapsing them into a single easy verdict? That last posture was the most demanding and the most honest. It required effort and a bit of humility. It traded comforting certainty for actual understanding, neat conclusions for better questions, quick outrage for longer engagement. Mar-a-Lago warranted that kind of attention, not because the building itself was somehow sacred or because its story was uniquely dramatic, but because it was right there in front of everyone, a concrete example that made big abstract issues visible, a piece of real estate where multiple strands of American life crossed in one tightly packed space. The mansion still stood on its 17 acres, holding nearly a century of accumulated history, waiting for Americans to decide what they wanted it to mean. That decision would ultimately say less about the house than about the people looking at it, what they noticed, what they brushed aside, which lessons they chose to take seriously and which they chose to ignore. The waves kept hitting the seawall. The structure held for now, and time moved forward, patient and relentless, giving everyone fewer excuses for pretending the choice was not theirs to make. The ocean would keep testing the foundations. Workers would keep maintaining the rooms. The building would keep demanding attention and resources. And somewhere in all of that, buried beneath the symbols and the politics and the headlines, was a simpler truth that the mansion had been trying to teach for nearly 100 years. Nothing built by human hands lasts forever without constant care. The most elaborate dreams require the most invisible labor. And the questions we refuse to ask about who benefits and who pays are the questions that matter most of all. The ocean continues its work with the patience of geological time, each wave a small negotiation with the seawall, each storm a test of what human engineering can withstand. The mansion stands as it has stood, but standing is not a passive state. It requires daily decisions, constant maintenance, an unending flow of human effort to hold back entropy. The gold leaf needs touching up. The imported tiles crack and must be replaced with approximations since the original sources vanished decades ago. The mechanical systems fail and get upgraded, each renovation erasing a little more of Marjorie's original vision while keeping the facade intact. This is the reality beneath every grand building. They survive not through their initial magnificence, but through the unglamorous work of preservation. through the people who notice the small failures before they become catastrophic. What Mar-a-Lago ultimately teaches is that monuments to individual achievement are always collective projects. Marjorie imagined she was building her own legacy. Trump believed he was rescuing and reimagining it, but both depended entirely on systems and labor they could not create alone. The Spanish tiles existed because craftsmen in Spain made them. The structure stands because workers pour concrete and repair damage. The club functions because staff arrive each day to cook and clean and maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. Strip away those contributions and what remains is simply wealth, inert and meaningless until transformed by human effort into something visible. This is perhaps why the mansion generates such intense reactions. It forces into view what American society usually keeps hidden: the vast distance between those who own and those who work, the way prosperity concentrates at the top while spreading risk and labor downward, the uncomfortable fact that every great fortune rests on foundations built by hands that will never be remembered. People react with either defensive celebration or furious condemnation, because acknowledging the complexity, seeing both the beauty and the exploitation, requires admitting that the systems producing our comfort are the same systems producing someone else's hardship. That admission does not come easily. It means accepting complicity, recognizing that we are all tangled in arrangements we did not personally design, but nonetheless benefit from or suffer under. The story of Mar-a-Lago will not end with any single conclusion, because buildings outlive the narratives built around them. The classified documents case will resolve or not. Trump will fade from the political stage eventually. New owners will arrive with new plans, and the mansion will adapt as it always has. Perhaps it becomes a museum finally, its rooms telling honest stories about wealth and labor and American ambition in all its contradictory forms. Perhaps it remains a club, continuing to monetize exclusivity for whoever can afford the membership fees. Perhaps rising seas make the choice for everyone, reclaiming the land and reducing all human arguments to irrelevance. Whatever happens, the building's meaning will keep shifting, reinterpreted by each generation according to their own concerns and values. But some truths remain constant regardless of interpretation. The workers who built Mar-a-Lago in the 1920s and the workers who maintain it today share more in common than either group shares with the owners. The mansion's beauty is real, and so is the inequality that produced it. Architecture can inspire and teach, while also embodying unjust systems. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist, layered like the sediment of history itself, each era depositing new meanings without fully erasing what came before. The choice Americans face is whether to engage with that complexity or retreat into simpler stories that feel satisfying but explain less. Mar-a-Lago offers an opportunity to practice a more mature relationship with the past, one that neither celebrates nor condemns wholesale, but instead tries to understand, that asks difficult questions about power and labor and legacy, that insists on seeing the people whose work made everything possible even when they were meant to stay invisible. This kind of historical thinking is harder than picking heroes and villains, but it is also more honest and ultimately more useful for anyone trying to build a more equitable future. The mansion stands on its narrow strip of Florida coastline, caught between ocean and inlet, between past and future, between competing visions of what it means and who it serves. The seawall holds back the Atlantic for now. The staff arrives each morning, the arguments continue in courtrooms and comment sections. And somewhere beneath it all, the original question Marjorie asked when she started building remains unanswered. What does it take to truly belong, and can anything we build ever really prove our worth? The palace she erected suggests the answer is no, that monuments cannot purchase the acceptance we crave, that significance imposed through wealth and spectacle remains hollow at its core. But perhaps that was never really the question that mattered. Perhaps what matters is simpler. Who did the work? Who benefits from it? And what responsibilities flow from that arrangement? Mar-a-Lago cannot answer those questions, but it makes them unavoidable for anyone willing to look closely enough. And in that sense, the mansion has finally achieved the importance Marjorie sought, not as proof of her individual greatness, but as a mirror reflecting America back to itself with uncomfortable clarity, demanding that we decide what we see and what we plan to do about it.